Thank you for being there. Today, I will go a bit deeper in the biodiversity uplift assessment that I went during the General Assembly. So some part will be redundant, but I think it's good to go one more time on it and so that you see a bit more what is behind this biodiversity uplift assessment. As I already mentioned, and it's very important to keep that in mind, for biodiversity uplift assessment, there are two rationales. The first one is practice-based, where we use criteria to verify that the people are doing the right thing at the right place. And the second one is outcome-based, where we can use indicators, indicator species, that show that what is being done yields the expected outcomes, and that biodiversity is indeed increasing. For the practices, we have a pretty fine list of practices that was mainly discussed with the Museum of Natural Science of Paris in France, and from previous projects. And it's more evidence-based. So it's based on the fact that all scientists agree that, for instance, stopping the use of pesticides will improve the biodiversity. For the outcomes is what we expect. So it's supposed to be directly connected with the practices, but of course, there might be some disconnection between what you are doing, like you plant a tree, and the fact that the tree will survive a heat wave that is coming and more frequent. So it's not because you planted a tree that the tree will survive. So the outcomes can be sometimes uncertain. Sometimes you have good surprise, sometimes you have bad surprise. But in any case, we know that if you have very rich biodiversity and the absence of invasive species in your place, it must be that you are doing the thing correctly. So the outcomes is a way to show that you've been doing a great work. So it comes later than the practice. And when I say later, it can be a lot later if it's a very slow ecosystem, like a forest. While if you dig a pond, in 1 or 2 years, you can already have all the biodiversity that you expect that it's in the new pond. So it depends on the type of ecosystem, the time lag between the practice and the outcomes. Of course, outcomes also needs to be, in some case, maintained, so that the conservation of biodiversity and conservation of biodiversity also has a cost in some cases. So we need to take that into account when we do the assessment of biodiversity uplift, that it's the cost of maintaining biodiversity is not to be neglected. So for the outcomes, there are two, we focus on two types of outcomes. The one is the presence of red list indicator species. The red list is from the IUCN, and they identify different levels of rarity or vulnerability of species. That's the example of Iris sibirica that we found in one site in Slovenia. So it's a very good indicator that what is being done in that place should be continued. And also the absence of invasive species. Here you have another place where you have solidago, and solidago is an invasive species. It might flower yellow or very beautiful. You might find it, but it covers everything. So you lose all the biodiversity of the grassland if solidago is expanding on this grassland. So those are two examples of outcomes. The hierarchy of the two, for me, is very important. Usually, when you have a low level of biodiversity, you start with practice-based biodiversity uplift assessment because the outcomes are not immediate, and you might also have negative outcomes at first before being able to recover. So there is a transition time between the start of the practice and the end of the practice, where the biodiversity level may not increase steeply like I showed, but it could decrease a little bit and then increase a lot, or evolve in a different way. So in this transition period, where we start from a very artificialized, very land use intensive area, and we stop some practices to improve biodiversity by using new practices that we know are better for biodiversity. There might be a period of time where the outcomes are not there, and also it's a very difficult period because it can also be linked with other issues for the practitioners. For instance, if you stop pesticides, the first species that will come back are the pests, and that's not something that you want in your crop. So before you can have integrated pest control and all the things that take more time to bring the predators back to your crop, you will have a lot of problems with your crop, and you will not have an increase of biodiversity because those pests will be considered as negative species. So it's important sometimes to take the time and to trust the fact that a given practice is on the long or mid-term or maybe short-term beneficial. Once the high level of biodiversity is achieved, then it's better to look at the outcomes, because even if a lot of studies have been made on the positive or negative impact of given practices, nature is much more complex than what we can model right now. And so sometimes the outcomes are not really associated with the best of the practice that you could imagine. And biodiversity is so complex and wide that sometimes practices that could be considered as of less biological interest could produce very good outcomes in some places because they are combined with a perfect biotope, and they are combined with other practices that were not taken into account. So it's very important here to leave rooms to local communities, because they have the knowledge of the local context much better than what we do, and also to look at what is present in a place to check that conservation should be maintained in the way it is. It is the logic of Natura 2000. Natura 2000, if an area is designed as Natura 2000, it means that it had a high biodiversity value, and if it had a high biodiversity values, the first rule is not to change the way this place is managed. It can have some conflict with other practices, like the common agricultural policy, for instance, and that's a pity. So it's something we might have to discuss later on from a legal point of view, how to manage that, and how to manage that in a biodiversity managing plan that takes the whole picture. But all I wanted to say here, from the point of view of biodiversity uplift assessment, is that if you get high outcomes, it means that the practice behind is good. And so it's not necessary to change the practice as long as you can warrant that the outcome is present in your area. So those two are complementary. One is more for the start, going from low, and the second is more when you reach a high level, then you keep going. And it should also be recognized as a positive effort for biodiversity, especially because if you have a rare species in a place, then this place can become a core area for the dispersion of this rare species and for the connectivity of around this very high hotspot. Then you need to be able to recognize that so that the species can recolonize around the place. So it's important to keep those species there. And if you don't have them anymore, then you really lose from a big part of the area. So those two outcomes, as I mentioned, are on one side the invasive species. In invasive species, what is very important is to stop introductions. By definition, invasive species are species that are very competitive, so they are able to take the place of other species. So once they are there, once they took the place in like you see, for instance, in England on the very west, it's all red. It means that there is a concentration of invasive species. Well, there it's become very, very difficult to fight against them. But there are spots where the color is yellow, and in those places, invasive species are nearly absent. So those are the places where there should be a bigger concern if an invasive species is in an area where you are supposed to restore biodiversity, because if it starts in a place that is well connected to other place where you want to increase the connectivity in order to bring rare species to the place, to allow species to go from one place to the other, to increase the genetic diversity and so on. Well, by increasing the connectivity in areas where you already have invasive species, you will also spread the invasive species. So you will do one thing that is good, but you will also have some negative impacts. So in those areas where you have a very low percentage of invasive species, it's very important to detect the invasive species as soon as possible and to destroy them before it's too late. On the west, I would say it's too late. And there, if you do something for biodiversity, but you find some invasive species, it doesn't matter so much, because we know that the effort to remove this invasive species will be huge. And if more upstream in the river, the invasive species as seeds every year, you will have this new invasive species that come back. So the practitioners should not be penalized to have a few invasive species in their place if they are in an area where the density of invasive species is already very, very large. You see different areas, and you see that the distribution of those invasive species it can vary a lot. Of course, all this comes from data that are freely available. So also the map is sometimes a bit biased because of the sampling. Some areas may be more sampled than others, and in those areas that are more sampled than others, you can have the impression that you have no invasive species, like in the black areas in Romania on the right. But it's maybe just because no one went there to check if the species were present or absent. So we need to be careful with that, but it's already a good sign to see if you are in an area where you have a lot of those invasive species, and so you don't need to care too much about the presence, or if you are in an area where you have very little of them, and then you need to be very, very strict and very, very cautious with whatever you do. We saw in Slovenia, for instance, they wanted to restore a grassland, but they brought some seeds from another grassland, And unfortunately from them, by bringing those seeds, they also brought some invasive species. So the restoration of the grassland, of course, they will manage that, but for them, it's extra work to remove the invasive species by bringing seeds from one place to the other. If they used the seeds from the existing place, they wouldn't have this invasive species in the place. Probably they won't have other species that are maybe of interest, but first priority should be to avoid those invasive species before you try to have some very rare species. So those invasive species, you can see here that the species composition can be very different in terms of, we see the second column, for instance, you have a lot of insects in use case 2, and while in use case 1, it's more a lot of flowers. So the distribution of those invasive species is also something it's interesting to look at. And usually this kind of difference and discrepancies is mostly due to the sampling effort and so the distribution of the species that we see. For the other side of the outcomes is the presence of vulnerable species, because those vulnerable species, because it's difficult to get them to grow in some place, usually there are not so good competitors. So if you find them, it means that the biotope is clearly appropriate. So the biotope is the ensemble of soil type, climate conditions, and also in some place the other part of the vegetation that is already there. So if you are in a good biotope and you find vulnerable species, those indicates that the management is correct, because otherwise those would not survive, because they are very fussy and they really have very strict needs. So if you don't find, it doesn't mean that it's bad, but if you find them, it means that it's good. Those core habitats where you have a very strong green color are the areas that need to be connected to the others in order to make a good, to allow nature to recolonize in a proper way, in a natural way. So the connectivity of those hotspots is very important. And you see, of course, that you also have some sampling difference. We have a lot of data in Italy. Of course, it's very interesting area also, so that's why we have good levels. Well, it's not Italy, so it's in north of France. But you see that in Romania, there are very sparse information. So one thing that could be needed in those places to do some inventory and to check if there is nothing missing, because it would be a pity to have some of the red list species and that they are not recorded, and so we manage the area like if the outcomes were not there. And it's also important to keep in mind that it's another reason for not using too much the outcomes as a target, because if you are in an area that was not monitored, and on the second year they say, look, we have 15 new endangered species that arrive in our place, just because they were not seen in the previous year, well, it's not normal. Huh? It's just because they were not monitored that the species appeared. So it's not necessarily an uplift of the biodiversity to have one spot that becomes green, 1 year. It's because of the lack of data of the previous year. So it's another reason why it's difficult to use outcome-based for the uplift. outcome-based should be rather used for the conservation actions. So once it's there, but it's very difficult to prove. If someone says, okay, it appeared in this place today, it's difficult to prove that it was not there the previous year. No one can go back in the past. So we need to be careful for not so good people who try to take advantage of outcome-based improvement to have criteria to properly assess that. Of course, if you start with an evaluation of biodiversity, which is sometimes quite costly, and then after a few years you see that the outcomes respond properly to the practice, then it's great, and it's something that should be rewarded, but it should not be done blindly. It should be, if you are in an area where some species are absent, well, they should first make sure that they are absent and not that they were unseen in the previous years. Now, so also it's important to say that we have specific outcomes that are based on the habitat types. So I spoke about the species, but there is the habitat, so the place where the species can be found. And for that, UNIS, so that's the European classification system of habitats, is very detailed. And if you reach the definition of a UNIS habitat type, and it means that you are on the top conditions for that. Most of the work use cases that we have in this project are not directly working on UNIS habitats because, for instance, for croplands, there is no UNIS habitat of croplands. We do have some UNIS habitats in grassland. We do have some UNIS habitats in forest. But it's not something that is always usable to the project, because we work in many areas that are used by human and not on very remote and biodiversity reserve and things like that. Those outcomes are also kind of linked with a lot of the natural regulation, restoration regulation of Europe. Those are more midterm targets. So for use case 1, for instance, there is a forest bird index. There are also lots of other criteria to assess the forest. But the one that is the most outcome-based is the population of forest birds that can be measured in terms of abundance and monitored through years with not too long response, contrary to, for instance, the number of dead trees or things like that, that can take a lot of time before it grows. For use case 2 and 3, you have the equivalent of forest bird index. It's the farmland bird index. So this is a very famous indicator that is unfortunately decreasing a lot in all Europe. But we see that in some places they were able to stabilize this index, and the natural restoration regulation has clear targets to increase those two indices by a given percentage. So this is a real challenge for biodiversity to change the curve of those lines. But it's very important to keep that in mind. You also have landscape features. It's between the outcome and the practice, but it's something that is visible and it's also directly measurable. And the soil quality, it's more and more an issue to make sure that we keep a good soil quality. Soil quality is also there for the outcomes for UC4 on grassland. And of course, for grassland, one of the main index in terms of outcome is the pollinator index, which includes wild bees, but also some night butterflies and other pollinators like I don't know in English, sorry. But there are 4 categories of pollinators that are taken into account for the pollinator index. And for use case 5, which is more about connectivity. So restoring the natural connectivity is a big topic for the river. And also along the river, we also have a lot of landscape features that are visible outcomes. I would say that another outcome, and it's a very important one, is the local community involvement and education. In our list, it was only mentioned for use case 5, but in fact, it makes sense to add it for all use cases, because it's also a matter of making people aware of the benefits of biodiversity, and for sustaining some biodiversity action, it's good that the people are fully aware of what they do. And it should also go the other way, because if you listen to the local communities, sometimes they know better than we do about how the biodiversity should be managed. So of course, and I will come to the practices in the next step, but all those practices, they are meant to be used, and they are generic. They are meant to be to make sense for a given ecosystem. But this ecosystem has many variation depending on where you are, depending if you are on a slope or on a bottom. It changes. So all those change. The microclimate and things like that make that you will not mow at the same date everywhere in the same country. So those local community have knowledge, and it's very important to include this knowledge into the practices. The practices are guidelines to have some more quantitative approach of the practice like they are described, because in the different document, I found that it's often difficult to have threshold and to have a good idea of what to look at precisely when you look at those big indicators that are defined. But it's like increasing the share of biodiversity rich areas, but this is not really this share of high biodiversity areas is not really well defined if you don't know what is a biodiversity-rich area, and if you don't know how big should be this share in what you do. So the practice-based have been suggested for the different use cases, and there are shared rationales with different interfaces. So usually we have compatibility with many of the other indices, but the way it's framed and the way we try to quantify those levels and things might not be exactly the same depending on the institution that is connected. So for nature restoration regulation, there is a lot of the target. All the targets are linked to one of our practice. So there are evidence from the scientific community that what we do as a practice will improve in terms of nature restoration regulation. Sometimes it's a direct link, like landscape features. If you plant a tree, then it's directly visible in terms of we need to plant millions of trees, so we want, you can tick a box on that. You can also tick a box on connectivity. can sometimes tick a box on landscape features. So those are nature restoration regulation targets. But if you want to improve the farmland bird index, it's not by one measure that you can improve that. In order to improve farmland bird index, you need to improve the habitat, you need to decrease the pesticide, and you need to improve the connectivity. Yes, John?
Yeah, thanks, Julien. No, it's really clear and interesting. I just wondered, puzzling, what do you mean by puzzling biodiversity? Because puzzling in English can mean both confusing and it can mean, you know, like a jigsaw. So jigsaw.
Yeah, it's.
What do you mean by puzzling biodiversity?
I was going to come back to that, but it's not something I mean. Puzzling biodiversity is the name of a project from the where carbon 4 is involved, and yeah, it's more in the sense of
jigsaw.
Jigsaw, yeah.
Yeah.
But it's the name of a project.
Okay. So I'll find it under carbon 4. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
So the net restoration regulation. One thing we discussed with Typhoon is the link with the International Capital Market Association and with the International Finance Corporation. They have guidelines on biodiversity bonds and nature bonds. So it's important to take that into account. As I will show later, it's mainly precisely described for arable land, but for other ecosystems, there is not much in those rules, or I didn't see them properly. We have payment for ecosystem services. Again, we discussed with AgroSolution about that. We have a lot of common targets, but the way it's quantified is not always the same. But we can converge, and of course, it can be adapted to the needs. But at one stage, it would be better if we could agree on what we do, because I mean, the way we measure can change a little bit what is done, but we want to have one method that is easily understandable and that can be reused in different purposes, instead of having different methods where every time you need to define a new methodology, a new data maybe, and so on. So it's important to agree on what we will use. And yeah, it's ongoing work to try to make as much links as we can. So as I said, puzzling biodiversity is another approach, and all our practice started from this project. Some of the use case, and I thank all use case for that, but I made a lot of suggestions to improve this list. But it was a very good starting point, especially for arable land. We have Copernicus Services. So Copernicus Services, as you know, it's the project from the EU based on the data from the ESA. And it's a lot of services are now provided about that can be used for biodiversity metrics. And we also have remotely sensed indices that's linked with work package 3. And in that case, it's more to fill the gaps where Copernicus services are not at the level that we want for biodiversity matrix computation. But we had a clear request from the EU reviewers to make sure that as much as possible we use Copernicus services. One of the reasons is that, of course, those services are free, and well, they are free for users, but EU is investing a lot of money into those services. So if we can use them instead of making new thing from scratch, it's very important. So now let's see a little bit in more detail what is inside each ecosystem type or use case group. So for the forestry, for instance, the five key groups are tree diversity, that is directly linked to the nature restoration regulation. Then you have the gamma diversity. So the gamma diversity is the diversity of habitats inside an area. So it's not having a very good forest, but if you have a good forest, and in the good forest you have some gaps, some areas where you have a small water body and things like that, and a small area where you still have some grassland, then you increase the gamma diversity, because the species that you will have in those areas is completely different from the species that you have in the forest. And so if you take a bigger view of that forest, you will increase, you will have a lot more much bigger number of species than if you had only the forest. Of course, there is a drawback to that, is that if you have too many gaps in your forest, then it's not a forest anymore. So those gamma diversity must have some constraint to avoid that the gaps are too big, and to make sure that you keep always a core forest area where inside the forest there is only forest, and you are not disturbing the species. And then, because we know that for forest it's very important to have a core area, and forest needs to be much bigger than grassland, for instance. For grassland, you can have a small grassland that is of very high biodiversity, but you will never get a forest that is of very high diversity if you only have one tree. Even if it's the most beautiful tree of the world, it will not be like inside a forest. Then we have the soil preservation. We mentioned several times the fact that it's important, especially when the soil is quite poor, to keep carbon there, and so to leave the branches after exploitation and so on. But there are also good practices in areas where the soil can be wet, not to go with big machinery that would compact the soil, avoid drainage in the forest that are near the river and so on. So those are all things that help to preserve the soil quality. The high-value trees, so for instance, the very old ones or the dead ones, increase the value of the area, and so respectful hunting, it's also important to keep that. Unfortunately, I would say for the ICMA, so the nature bonds, they're only looking at the share of biodiversity-friendly forest management, but we need all the above in order to define what is the part of the forest that is biodiversity-friendly forest management, where we achieve that, and what is the level as also need to be determined, because I mean, usually forest is more biodiversity-friendly than arable land in terms of management, but there are different levels of this biodiversity friendliness. So I will see that the time is running, so I will quickly go through those. Yeah, maybe I will not spend, because it's all in the document that is shared on the platform. But those are examples. But this is the full list of the guidelines. So that could be picked up if you want to do some biodiversity uplift assessment in your area. Of course, not all of them need to be picked up, and you can add some new ones, but it's already, for all of those, you have a description of levels from 0 to 5 to see if it's what level you reach, and so to be able to measure the uplift. And you see on the right the article of the nature restoration regulation that is linked to those. Sometimes there is no mention, for instance, hunting, but yeah, it was thought to be important to look at hunting for, especially in some countries where there is a lot of hunting, where hunting can become an issue. It's important to keep in mind that it's also important to look at that, even if it's not mentioned in the net restoration regulation. So yeah, again, this is the second part. So all those are part of one of the 5 groups that I showed before. And this is an example of what can be done. So for tree diversity, one of the big challenge is the climate change, because we will probably not see the forest that we plant today. The examples on the right are the people who planted a forest of oaks to have boats. Now boats are in metal. They planted pines for the mines, but no, there are no more mines underground, at least not so many. But there is a clear impact of what you plant. You need to think of the possible change of climate in the area where you are. For instance, for the alpine forest, probably, most probably, the limit between the valley forest and the large forest will change, and the trees will be able to colonize more to higher altitudes, because the duration of the snow period is decreasing. So we will have more trees that can go higher, and the temperate forest will come to the valleys, and so we will have more broadleaf trees in the valleys than what we can have now. So it's important to keep that in mind if you restore some place, not to be in a situation where you will be fighting against climate all the time. I mean, climate change is something that is kind of irreversible for a long period of time, even longer than the forest. So we need to take that into account if we manage, and that's why suitable species should take climate into account. Gamma diversity, as I mentioned, the idea is to have habitat. So you see from 0 where you had no open habitat, and to 5 where you have 5 open habitats. But those open habitats should be less than 3 to 5%. So it would be very micro habitats that we want to have in the forest, and not a clear cut of half the forest. Some of the species that live in the forest need those kind of open areas to reproduce or to hunt. So it's very important for them to have some gamma diversity in the forest that is managed, and not full cover everywhere. Before, those species survive because before, every time you had some hazard, like a fire or storm or things like that, you had new gaps in the forest, and so there was a dynamic in the forest with a lot of gaps that took some time to recover, and those species were used to live in those gaps. If we manage not to have any fire anymore, which is good for many things, the creation of those gaps, well, you don't have those gaps anymore. So it's something that you lose by managing the forest in some way. Now, moving to the crops. For crops, there's also 5 practices. And it's important to say, especially for crops, that those practices also increase the robustness of the farmers. So I think we should not see negatively biodiversity as opposed to crop production and so on. In many cases, not all the time, but in some cases, the fact that you use biodiversity-friendly practices can also increase your production, especially when you rely on pollinators. So it's very important to keep that in mind in terms of communication and engagement, I think. So the first one is to reduce chemical pesticides. For me, it's the most obvious. it's linked with One Health, it's linked with the IFC, but strangely, it's very rarely mentioned in the nature restoration regulation, maybe because they are more looking at the outcomes. But in order to get those outcomes, it's the first and most important things to do. The other one is the diversification of practices. And it's important to think that for the system, it's good to have a diversification if you want to be able to reduce chemicals. Because if you don't diversify, then the reduction of the chemicals will be more difficult. So it's very important to keep that in mind, that many of the small landscape features, the diversification of practice, and the soil protection are important in order to be able to reduce the use of pesticides without too much loss of production. Then you have the small landscape features, biodiversity safer practices, and soil protection. And again, it's very bad. I hate people who do that, so sorry about that, but I will skip those things. Just an example, there are some maps. We need to go deeper into that because you are not the experts on agricultural land, but we could find some data to make maps of the chemicals in. So that's an example for the use of chemicals in Romania. And those chemicals are often perceived as unique solution, but of course they are not. Another things that can be mapped is the crop diversification. Again, there we all agree that diversification is good, but we don't have the same indicators. On the right you have Romania, and on the left you have north of France. You see that for the same indicator we have different value. Like in Romania, it's less diversified than in France. We reach much more blue areas where we are above the threshold that is seeked for the payment for ecosystem services with a level of 7, and in the brown it means that we are below the level where it's considered acceptable for diversification. So those are the areas that should be in priority diversified. Simpson is some kind of smoothing of the number of species based of the crop types based on what is behind. Then you can look at the diversity itself, so the number of crop types, where you see can change from 1 to 0 just because 1 pixel of the crop was there. I insist that here we look at the landscape, and it's important for me to look at the landscape level, but of course the practice would be applied by the farmers. So that's why it's important for me to have several farmers together to be able to think with them how and where to diversify, because diversifying an exploitation where there is already a high diversity around is not a big added value to the diversity. But if you diversify in a dark brown area, then this farmer will have a very big impact on its landscape. So those maps can be used for setting threshold, because you see that you don't have the same baseline level in Romania and in France, so you should not expect the same effort from the farmers. But it can also be used to locate specific farmers to optimize the way you can diversify. And sometimes they don't need to diversify so much, but they need just to talk together to get better diversification of the landscape. Another thing is to look at the connectivity. Here, it's a connectivity between patches of Natura 2000 areas of forest. And you see that the corridors, so the yellow areas, the places where you have the pesting, are between the Area 2000, Natura 2000 areas. But unfortunately, the use case are not in those corridors. So in terms of really the places where connectivity should be improved and strengthened is more on the corridors than outside of the corridors. So yeah, and same with Romania. We are also outside of corridors if you want to have a focus on what type of connectivity should be improved, like forest or grassland. But it's important to keep that in mind. For grassland, I will go quickly. Low land use intensity is good, limited fertilization, improving floral resources and habitat quality. The last two are outcome-based. And I didn't find any clear link with ICMA except the share of high biodiversity grassland in an area. But again, this is only if you reach the top level that you can start talking about that. So those are the practices. For watershed management, there are 4 components: restoring hydrological functioning, increasing the freshwater connectivity, increasing the vegetation connectivity, and improving the habitat quality of aquatic and wetland habitats. So the last one is, again, an outcome-based indicator, and the other ones are mainly linked with the connectivity using buffer areas and so on. Just for the use of remote sensing there, just to mention that, yes, this is a nightlight map. So the current satellites are 2 cores with the freely available data, but we requested some data for a feasibility study. So maybe we will be able to do something at a higher resolution, but it's not sure. So to conclude, those guidelines should be considered as a menu, and so you can pick the ones that are interesting to you. If you want to add some new ones, please feel free to let us know. The deliverable has been submitted, but maybe we will get some comments, so we can include that in the last version. The main added value from my point of view is that the level of detail of the practices and the outcomes is clearly mentioned in those guidelines. So that's something I didn't find anywhere else. And I think it's necessary for having a good granularity of the evaluation of biodiversity uplift to have those levels of details. The baseline should be adapted to local context. I don't think that there is one value for payment for ecosystem services or for when you start rewarding the people, that is one base value that should be used everywhere. It should be looked at what is the average in a region and trying to uplift based on the average. Of course, once 5 years later, if the average increase, then we can change the threshold, but it has to be adapted to the local context, absolutely. Otherwise, it can be either too easy for some people or too difficult for the others. And in both cases, it's not optimal. And the involvement of local communities is therefore very important because they are the ones that would look with the local context and would help us to improve that. Thank you for your attention.